"We're only playing," she reminded him. But the Mafia boss pulled her closer at the altar. The rain against the stained glass of St. Verity was a constant, cold percussion. Port Crescent did not drizzle, it assaulted. Inside the old church, the air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and beeswax. The main hall lit only by a few strategic spotlights for the rehearsal. It was a stage set for a lie. Juno Hart stood at the altar, the borrowed ivory dress stiff against her skin. Opposite her, Rowan Kazarian watched, his presence sucking the air from the cavernous space. "We're only playing," Juno whispered, the words meant for him alone, a reminder for herself. Rowan's hand tightened on her waist, a proprietary grip that was part of the performance. He pulled her closer, flush against the hard lines of his tuxedo, until her breath hitched. "The crowd needs to believe it's real," he murmured, his voice a low gravel that vibrated through her. This was Juno's specialty, not weddings, but crises. As an urban crisis manager, she had a reputation for finding the rot in city projects, for dragging dirty contracts and backroom deals into the light. She was the one you called when the foundation was cracked and the rats were visible. This time, she was the lure, the Atlas Interdiction Office, a clandestine interagency task force so secret its name was barely a rumor, had recruited her. Her mission: infiltrate the underground network strangling the port, and the only way in was on the arm of the man who ran it. Rowan Kazarian was the shadow boss of the Kazarian Consortium. On paper, they were a logistics empire, a model of East Coast efficiency. Off the books, they controlled the gray routes, the shipping lanes that moved things the light never touched. He was the gatekeeper. The entire operation hinged on a piece of archaic lore. Rumor on the docks was that the Sable Crown Trust, the Kazarian family's immense generational fund, would only be released when the heir entered into a public marriage. Unlocking that trust would give Rowan the capital to shatter the rival coalition that was trying to bleed his port dry. So, a fake wedding was staged. In the intimate, false glow of the altar candles, Juno felt a genuine shiver trace its way down her spine. Rowan's gaze missed nothing. "When you tremble," he said, his voice dropping, "they smell fear." Juno tilted her chin up, refusing to be read so easily. "I'm trembling because the dress is too tight," she countered, the lie sharp. It was a parry, a deflection from the fact that his proximity was a physical weight. Theirs was a Cold War fought with witty retorts and shielded eyes. Miles away, parked behind the skeletal cranes of Glass Harbor, the AIO command van was silent save for the hiss of audio feed. They were listening to every word, every shift in breathing. Juno's file was open on a monitor, her face illuminated in the green-black light. Codename Blueprint. Suddenly, from the darkness of the upper balcony, a small red light blinked twice. A click, barely audible, followed by the faint whir of a motor-driven camera. It was not AIO tech, it was a timer, precise and unauthorized, the first crack in their carefully constructed reality. Juno's body tensed, her instinct screaming to locate the threat, but she was a bride. She held her pose, her gaze locked on Rowan, forcing a softness she did not feel. Rowan, as if sensing the shift, moved closer. This was not in the script. He was supposed to simulate the vows. Instead, he lifted a hand, not to her face, but to her temple, his thumb brushing the hairline. He leaned in, and for the symbolic kiss, he pressed his forehead against hers. It was not a kiss. It was an invasion. It was too close. Juno smelled the clean, expensive scent of his soap, felt the warmth radiating from his skin. It was a calculated intimacy, meant to look profound for the hidden lens, but her own heart, the traitor in her chest, stuttered. It missed a beat, a painful, physical lurch. He held the pose for 3 seconds, 4, then he pulled back, his eyes dark, unreadable. They separated, the required distance of the ceremony restored. As the organist began a muted chord, Rowan leaned in one last time, his breath brushing her ear, the words a blade of ice. Don't forget to breathe. Blueprint. Juno froze. He knew. He knew her code name. The entire operation, her cover, her leverage, all of it evaporated in that single word. Before she could recalibrate, before she could even process the magnitude of her failure, the great oak doors at the back of the church groaned open. A wet, cold wind rushed up the aisle, extinguishing half the altar candles and making the remaining spotlights flicker. The wind brought something with it, a flurry of white paper, scattering across the stone floor like diseased doves. One landed at Juno's feet, the ink still wet, the message stark. The wedding will be a funeral. 3 weeks earlier, the coffee in the government-issued styrofoam cup tasted like battery acid. Juno sat in a windowless room in a building that didn't officially exist, the fluorescent lights humming a flat, irritating E-flat. "You hammered the Port Crescent Redevelopment Authority," said the man across the table. He was gray in every respect, gray suit, gray hair, gray eyes. "They were rigging land allocations for the new container terminal," Juno said, her voice flat. She was still coming down from the adrenaline of the takedown. It was a simple audit. "It was nothing simple, Miss Hart," the gray man said. "You didn't just find the fraud, you exposed the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the city councilman who signed off on it. You ruined them, publicly." "They ruined themselves. I just turned on the lights." "And that," the man said, leaning forward, "is why you are here." He slid a file across the table. One name, Rowan Kazarian. "The AIO," the man continued, naming the Atlas Interdiction Office for the first time, "has a Kazarian problem. He's clean on paper. His logistics consortium is legitimate. But nothing moves on the East Coast gray market weapons. Contraband, information without his shadow network taking a percentage. He's insulated by 10 layers of buffers." "So, arrest him," Juno said. "Why? We can't get near him. Our agents, our surveillance, our financial trackers. He burns them all. He's a ghost. He doesn't trust anyone who looks like us." The man tapped the file. "But you don't look like us. You speak the language of the boardroom, but you came from the docks. You understand both zoning regulations and street-level leverage. You are the only person who can walk in both worlds." "What's the play?" "A vulnerability. The Sable Crown Trust, his family's old money, billions of it, locked by an archaic stipulation. It only unlocks when he marries, publicly. He needs that capital to crush a rival, the Glass Harbor Collective." Juno stared at him. "You want me to date him?" "We want you to marry him," the man corrected. "A fake engagement, a very public, very fast romance. It's the only way to draw his rivals out. They cannot let him get that money. If they think he's solidifying his empire, they will have to make a move. You will be the bait." The AIO manufactured her cover in 48 hours. Juno Hart, the brilliant but discreet reputation consultant, newly hired by the Chandelier Hotel Group to oversee their waterfront expansion. It gave her a legitimate reason to be at the Maritime Ironworks Museum charity dinner. The museum was loud, all steel beams and clinking champagne flutes. Juno, wearing a minimalist black dress that screamed expensive consultant, moved through the crowd. Her target was near a 19th century ship's anchor. She waited for the scrum of local press to turn his way. Then she made her move. She stumbled, a slight, credible misstep, bumping his arm just hard enough to make him turn. "Mr. Kazarian, my apologies." He looked at her. His eyes were not cold, as she expected, but intensely focused, assessing her in a single, comprehensive glance. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice even. He recognized her. The AIO was right. Her PCRA takedown had put her on his radar. "I was admiring the exhibit," she said, nodding to the anchor. "Amazing how they relied on sheer weight. Modern maritime law is so much more complex, especially the Port Authority liability clauses regarding deep water anchorage." Rowan's polite, public mask flickered. It was a micro-expression, a flash of genuine surprise. This woman in this dress was not supposed to be talking liability clauses. "You're familiar with maritime law?" The Chandelier Group is considering a new build on Pier 9, Juno said, feeding him the cover. It's my job to analyze the reputational risk, and the current Port Authority regulations are a mess. They contradict the 1923 municipal charter. He stared at her. The noise of the party seemed to fade. You've read the 23 charter. I don't advise on projects I haven't stress tested, she said. Rowan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. My current image consultants are worried about the color of our new uniforms. He took a card from his jacket. Echelon Tower, Friday, 10 a.m. I need a real stress test. He walked away, leaving her in the flashbulb afterglow. The lure was set. Before the meeting, the AIO handler briefed her again. You're wearing a wire. It's in the hairpin. We need his organizational structure, but be careful. Cade Volkov, the head of the Glass Harbor Collective, is ex-Spetsnaz. He's not subtle. He'll try to break this engagement, hard. Keep your head down. Juno entered Echelon Tower. It was less a headquarters and more a fortress of glass and brushed steel overlooking the harbor. His office was vast, but dominated by a single massive planning table. She expected maps of shipping routes. She found architectural models. This, she said, touching the edge of a meticulously detailed model, is a residential complex. It is, Rowan said from the window, and a trade school, and a public park on the waterfront. She looked at the blueprints. They were real, detailed, and budgeted. This was a plan for thousands of dock workers and their families. It was the last thing she expected from a mob boss. The port needs stability, he said, walking toward her. Stability requires a healthy workforce. A healthy workforce requires community. It's just logistics. Miss Hart. This isn't logistics. This is urban planning, and it's good. He stopped in front of her. Did you come here to discuss my image or my infrastructure? He knew. The meeting wasn't about PR. It was his own counter-interrogation. He picked up a single folder from his desk and pushed it toward her. Her real file. Not the Chandelier cover. It had her university transcripts, her white papers on urban decay, and a photo of her accepting an award for the PCRA investigation. You like to look beneath the surface, Rowan said, his voice quiet. You dig. I admire that. The AIO thinks they can use you to find my mask. Juno's blood ran cold. The hairpin felt like it weighed 10 pounds. He leaned in, his gaze pinning her. So, here is the offer. Do you want to see the mask or do you want to see the scar? It was the real invitation, not to a job, but to the center of the storm. Juno met his gaze. The wire was recording, but this answer was just for him. The scar. Rowan nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Good, because the mask is about to get us married. She reported back to AIO. They were furious he'd made her, but ecstatic he was pulling her in. He's arrogant, the gray man said. He thinks he can control you. This is perfect. The mission was upgraded, given a new, chilling designation, Operation Marionette. The next day, in a lawyer's office high above Port Crescent, they signed the contract. It was a prenuptial agreement, ironclad, detailing the terms of a temporary public union. As they left, Rowan held the elevator for her. You understand what this is? Miss Hart, this wedding is a trap. We are baiting the hook for Cade Volkov. We are painting a target on our own backs. I can handle a target, Juno said. This isn't just a target, Rowan replied, his voice low as the doors slid shut. This is a war, and we just sent out the invitations. Port Crescent revealed itself at night. By day, it was just another struggling port city, but in the dark, it became a living entity. The overpasses were arteries of sodium orange light, intertwining like veins over the black mass of the industrial yards. Glass towers, new and arrogant, cast long shadows over the brick and iron skeletons of the old docks. From the high windows of Echelon Tower, you could see the small, bright squares of the all-night diners on Rook Pier, watching the water like lonely eyes. Rowan did not give her the polished Echelon tour. He took her into the nervous system, the inspection, as he called it, was a midnight walk through the refrigerated warehouses and container terminals. He moved through the darkness with a predator's economy of motion, nodding to the night shift supervisors who watched him with a mixture of fear and absolute loyalty. Juno was the analyst. She was supposed to be looking for AIO's smoking gun, for the illicit manifests. Instead, she saw the system. His cold storage units had a spoilage rate of less than 2%, a number the corporate chains could only dream of. His logistics software, likely proprietary and deeply illegal, managed the flow of goods with zero waste. She realized what he was doing. It was not just control, it was order. He had taken the chaotic, violent, and wasteful black market of the docks and streamlined it. He had replaced random brutality with ruthless efficiency. It was its own kind of governance, and in its own way, it saved lives. They were standing at the end of Pier 9, the wind whipping her hair across her face, when her phone vibrated. It was not a call. It was a secure message from a number she did not recognize. The message contained only a single, high-resolution photograph. It was her, 3 weeks ago, walking into the bland, concrete building that officially housed the AIO. The angle was from a window across the street. The timestamp was precise. It was not a threat from Cade Volkov. This was too subtle. This was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. It was a warning from a different player on the board, one who saw everything. Juno did not show Rowan. She did not flinch. If they wanted to play a game of shadows, she would fight them in the light. The next morning, she activated her own network. She fed a narrative to a hungry society columnist, a story of love against the odds. She crafted the angle herself, the brilliant, data-driven urban planner, tired of boardroom corruption, finding an unlikely partner in the misunderstood king of the docks, the reformer and the rogue. It was a story Port Crescent wanted to read, a story of redemption and power. It forced her unseen enemies to show their faces. And they did. The Metropolitan Integrity Commission, a self-appointed watchdog group, immediately launched an inquiry into Juno Hart's professional past. Juno knew exactly who the MIC was. It was a board funded entirely by the same real estate magnates and shipping rivals who had lost millions in her Port Crescent Redevelopment Authority takedown. They saw her alliance with Rowan not as a romance, but as a hostile takeover. They started leaking manipulated data from her old projects, painting her as a corporate mercenary. Rowan's response was not violence. He did not threaten the MIC. He simply changed the conversation. He called his own press conference at the Longshoremen's Union Hall. He did not address the attacks on Juno. Instead, he announced the formation of the Bridge Hand Scholarship Fund, a multi-million-dollar endowment to pay for the college education of every dockworker's child, funded personally by the Khazarian Consortium. Juno stood at the back of the crowded hall, watching him at the podium. He was not just buying good press or shielding her. The way he spoke the names of the old Union families, the way he referenced the 1954 strike, this was personal. He was honoring the people who had built his family's wealth. He was proving, in public, that his power was not just for himself. The war, however, had two fronts. The MIC fought with lawyers and headlines. Cade Volkov fought with fire. That night, they were in the container yard, reviewing the new security sensors Rowan was installing. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of diesel and salt. There was no warning, just a sharp pop hiss from a catwalk 200 yards away. A magnesium flare ignited, sputtering to life and bathing the entire yard in a blinding chemical white light. They were illuminated, perfect targets. Rowan did not shout. He did not pause. He reacted. His hand clamped around her waist like a steel band, and he drove her sideways, tackling her off her feet. They crashed behind a stack of heavy, iron-strapped wooden pallets. The air split, a supersonic crack, a microsecond before the sound of the rifle shot. The bullet, meant for Rowan's center mass, screamed off the steel corrugated wall of a container, exactly where they had been standing. Cade. Rowan's voice was not a word, just a low growl of absolute certainty. The war had arrived at the door. The flare sputtered, plunging the yard back into darkness. The only light was the distant moon. "Are you hit?" His voice was rough, his body still heavy, shielding hers. "No," Juno breathed, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat. He rolled off her, moving to a crouch. The air was cold, cutting. He shrugged out of his suit vest, the fine material still warm, and draped it over her shoulders. As he moved, his white shirt pulled taut across his back. In the pale moonlight, she saw it. High on his left shoulder, disappearing under his collar, was a puckered, discolored mess of scar tissue. It was old, badly healed, and brutal. It was the scar he had offered to show her. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they were the wrong kind. Not police. Fire. A hook and ladder truck, followed by a pumper, roared past the entrance to the container yard, heading deeper into the port. "They're not coming for us," Juno said, pulling the vest tighter. She lifted her head, sniffing the air. The wind had shifted. It was not just diesel. It was gasoline. "Warehouse 4, Rowan said, his eyes fixed on the distant red lights. "The sniper was a diversion. He's burning out a rival's inventory." A fake fire crew, a deliberate distraction. Juno smelled the gasoline again, and knew. It was not just a fire to destroy goods. It was a fire set to destroy all the evidence. The fallout from the sniper attack was colder than the near miss itself. Back in the soundproofed silence of the Echelon Tower penthouse, Juno confronted him. The scent of cordite and gasoline still clung to her clothes. "This stops being a game when they use live ammunition. Rowan, we need to talk about the Sable Crown Trust. No more layers." He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Port Crescent reflecting in the glass like a circuit board. "It's exactly what the rumor says. Old money, a ridiculous amount of it." "And the wedding," she pressed. "Why public? You run a shadow empire. You can't forge a marriage certificate." "My great-grandfather," Rowan said, his voice flat, "was a deeply superstitious man who trusted no one, especially his own bloodline. He wrote the charter in 1905. He believed the port was a living entity, a community witness. The trust only unlocks when the heir makes his bond before the community. It's archaic, it's insane, and it's ironclad. No public ceremony, no capital. So Cade Volkov just has to stop the ceremony. Or stop me." Cade chose the law first. The next morning, lawyers representing the Glass Harbor Collective filed a public injunction to halt the wedding, the charge conspiracy to commit public fraud. They argued the union was a sham transaction designed to illegally manipulate the financial markets by releasing the trust's assets. Simultaneously, the Metropolitan Integrity Commission launched its second offensive. They leaked a file detailing Juno's work 2 years prior, a consultation for an investment firm that had later been investigated by the state. The implication was clear: Juno Hart was not a reformer. She was a fixer for criminals. But the MIC had miscalculated. The bridge hand scholarships had already taken root, the Longshoremen's Union, in a move that stunned the city council, issued a public statement condemning the MIC for attacking the only person who sees our children as an investment. The smear campaign stalled, painting Juno as a target of the city's entrenched elite. "Volkov uses the courts. The MIC uses the press," Rowan said, dropping the injunction papers on his desk. "They're fighting on paper, but the real power isn't in those towers. It's on the docks, and the bosses need to see you." He didn't take her to a boardroom. He took her to a vast, chilled warehouse at dawn. The Council of Dock Bosses was waiting, 7 of them, men with hands like worn leather and eyes that measured worth in tonnage, not dollars. They sat around a metal table, drinking black coffee from thermoses. "This is the woman." One of them, a man named Silas, said. His voice was like rocks grinding together. "She's the reason Volkov is shooting up our yards." Juno didn't apologize. She walked to the wall map of the port's shipping channels. "He's shooting at you because he's desperate," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air. "You're all feeling the squeeze on your rates. That's because Cade is moving 90% of his illicit goods through the 5th channel. hidden in legitimate, low-tax agricultural manifests? She tapped the map. Rowan's capital will upgrade the scanners on Terminals 1 through 4, making that channel obsolete. But that's not the kill shot. The kill shot is moving all agricultural shipping to a single, secure, legal channel. We force him to use our route, under our scanners. We cut his cash flow off at the knees. He can't pay his enforcers if his product is rotting on the water. The warehouse was silent. The bosses looked at the map, then at Rowan, who hadn't said a word. They looked back at Juno. She hadn't offered a promise. She delivered a battle plan. Silas nodded once. She thinks like she's hauling, not talking, she'll do. She had their respect. The victory was short-lived. That night, her AIO handler cornered her in the sterile lobby of the Chandelier Hotel. "You're getting too close. Blueprint," the gray man said. "I'm getting results. Isn't that what you want?" "We want the ledger. The wedding is the perfect distraction. Volkov will make a move. The MIC will be watching, and Khazarian security will be focused outward. We need you to access his main server. It's in the Echelon penthouse. Get us the data, and we pull you out." Juno stared at him. She thought of the blueprints for the dockworker housing, the scholarships, the brutal, functional order Rowan had imposed on a chaotic system. And what happens to the port when you shatter that system? "That's not your concern," the handler replied, his eyes cold. "Your concern is the mission, the black and white." But Juno could no longer see in black and white. She retreated to her own cover apartment at the Gilded Finch rooftop, a place of glass walls and cold, minimalist furniture. She was pacing, the city lights blurring below, when she saw it, an envelope, heavy cardstock, slipped under her door. No stamp, no name. Inside, a single sentence was written in sharp, precise cursive. "Change roles. Heart, you're the prey." It wasn't Cade's brutal style. It wasn't the AIO's bureaucratic threat. This was the third player, the one who had taken her picture at the safe house. She was still holding the note when Rowan appeared at the door. He didn't knock. His security had simply bypassed the buildings. "You should be at Echelon," he said, his eyes scanning the empty room. "It's just a performance. Remember?" she said, the words hollow. He stepped inside, bringing the cold night air with him, his gaze fixed on her face, intense, searching. "Then tell me," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual armor. "If this is all an act, why do you look at me like it's real?" The question landed like a blow, a raw, unexpected vulnerability. He was asking if he was the only one who felt the script dissolving. Before she could find an answer, her AIO secure phone buzzed, a text, the handler. The injunction hearing had been fast-tracked. Cade was winning. We're losing the window. The wedding has to happen now. And we're making it public. We're leaking the feed to every news outlet, a live broadcast. We're forcing every player's hand. Juno looked from the note in her hand to Rowan's waiting face. They were turning her into a public sacrifice. She typed her reply to the AIO. "I'll be there. I'll walk down your aisle, but I am setting the terms now. I'm going in as Blueprint, but I'm walking out as myself. And I reserve the right to stop this entire ceremony. Live on your broadcast. If I see one innocent person sacrificed for your metrics, you want a show, you'll get one." She hit send, severing the connection. The game was no longer the AIO's or Cade's. It was hers. The dock was a different world before dawn. It was not a place, but a collection of sounds. Rowan took Juno to the edge of Rook Pier, where the water, black and oily, slapped against the pilings. "Close your eyes," he commanded. She did. The city noise was a distant hum. Here, the sound was sharp. "Listen," he said, his voice low, close to her ear. "What do you hear?" "Water, a mooring chain, wind rattling a sheet of metal." "Listen deeper," he pressed. "The water is rhythm, the chain is rhythm, the metal is rhythm. You listen for the break, the sound that doesn't belong." He was silent for a full minute. She focused. She heard the rhythmic clank of the chain, the steady wash of the tide, then something else. A scrape. Footsteps on gravel, but uneven, one foot, then a drag. Uneven footsteps, she whispered. 200 yards, by the east barrier. One person limping. He's a night watchman, Rowan said. Bum knee? He's fine. But you heard him. That's the lesson. You don't look for danger. You listen for the interruption in the pattern. He was teaching her survival, his way. She, in turn, was preparing for her own, that afternoon, in the privacy of her gilded Finch apartment. She worked on her data anchor. It was a smart wallet, a high-end designer piece the AIO had provided. She'd spent a week reprogramming its internal chip. It was now a high-capacity, encrypted data drive, disguised as a payment processor. It had one function, activated only by a specific two-finger tap against the leather-wrapped aluminum rim. It would copy, encrypt, and store any data packet it came into contact with. It was her escape plan, her leverage, her insurance policy against both Rowan and the AIO. The next day brought a new player to the table. Cade Volkoff requested a meeting, not in a boardroom, but at the Greenway Conservatory, a massive Victorian glass house filled with rare, tropical plants. The air was thick, humid, and smelled of damp earth and orchids. Cade was waiting by a wall of pitcher plants. He was younger than she expected, dressed in a sharp, European-cut suit, an easy smile on his face. Juno Hart, the woman giving the city elite a migraine, he said, his accent a faint echo of Eastern Europe. I admire your work. I doubt that, Mr. Volkoff. No, I do, he insisted, gesturing for her to walk. You see chaos and you build a system. I do the same. We are architects. Rowan is just a gatekeeper. He inherited his empire. You and I, we build. He stopped, turning to her. This engagement, it's a business deal. I know it. You know it. He needs the trust to break me. But what if you chose a different partner? He leaned in, his voice a persuasive whisper. A word from you, and the MIC investigation into your past evaporates. A new file is created. Your reputation is scrubbed clean, globally. You are a genius, Miss Hart. Why be a queen in his crumbling castle when you can be a partner in a new enterprise? Ditch the relic. Join the future. Juno let the silence stretch, pretending to weigh the offer. That's a compelling pitch, she said, finally. But Rowan is a powerful man to cross. He's a man bound by rules, by his great-grandfather's dusty will. I don't believe in rules. Across the conservatory, through the dense fronds of a fern, she saw Rowan. He was standing with two of his men, ostensibly admiring the architecture. He was not looking at the architecture. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. He was watching Cade, and his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Juno, still looking at Cade, lifted her hand as if to brush her hair back, her fingers grazing the smart wallet in her pocket. 2 taps, quick, subtle. A signal only Rowan would understand. It's a performance. I'm playing him. Rowan's posture did not change, but she saw the tension in his jaw ease by a single, almost imperceptible degree. The MIC tried a different approach. A representative, a slick lawyer, cornered her outside the Chandelier Hotel. The wedding day is going to be chaos. Miss Hart. Mr. Volkoff is unstable. The AIO is watching. You are in the middle of a war zone. The Metropolitan Integrity Commission can offer you full protection, a secure car, a safe room, federal marshals. And the price, Juno asked? A simple press statement delivered before the ceremony. You state that your investigation into the Khazarian Consortium revealed gross misconduct, and that you cannot, in good conscience, proceed. You walk away, a hero, and we handle the rest. Juno looked the lawyer in the eye. I don't sell protocol for fear, Mr. Bradshaw. Find someone else to bribe. That night, they were at St. Verity for the final rehearsal. The church was empty, cold and echoing. They stood at the altar, the placeholder priest watching. And now, the vows, the priest said, his voice booming. Rowan looked at her. The script felt ridiculous. Rowan, he began, his voice rough. He stopped. You're supposed to say the line, Juno whispered. the sound too loud in the silence. "It's a farce." "Then let's get the blocking right," she said, trying to regain control. "The part where you—" "The forehead thing. For the cameras." He stepped closer. The 2 feet of space between them became 6 inches. He smelled like the cold night air and something faintly metallic, like steel. He slowly, hesitantly, leaned in and rested his forehead against hers. It was the same move from the first night, but this time, there was no audience. This time, his eyes were open, inches from hers. She could feel his breath, warm and uneven, against her lips, her own breath caught, her rehearsed lines vanishing. They stood frozen, breathing each other's air, the silence of the church absolute. She started, but her voice faltered, breaking the stillness. Rowan pulled back as if burned, a deep, unreadable emotion flashing in his eyes before he masked it. The tension was still thick when they returned to Echelon Tower. A package was waiting on the penthouse's main table. It was from the AIO's designated bridal courier. Juno opened the long, flat box. Inside, nestled on white satin, was the wedding veil. It was beautiful, antique lace studded with tiny, glittering seed pearls. Juno lifted it. The pearls were too hard, too uniform. She ran her thumb over one. It was not a pearl. It was a lens, a high-resolution, wide-angle microcamera. The veil was wired. They were all cameras. The AIO was not just watching the wedding. They were planning to see it from her own point of view. They were turning her into their personal surveillance unit. "They crossed the line," she said, her voice quiet, cold. She began to pull the pearls from the lace, one by one, the delicate fabric tearing. She dropped the lenses and their wires into the box. "I will not be bait for any side, not Cade's, not the Mike's, and not theirs." Rowan watched her, his expression grim. "They're all the same," he said, his voice heavy. "They use people until they break. Cade. He did this before. My cousin, Leo. He was young, stupid, wanted to prove himself. Cade's people promised him a piece of the action. They used him to get leverage on my rotes, and when he was no longer useful, they put 2 bullets in his head and left him in the 5th channel." He looked at the broken cameras in the box. "I don't want any more souls on the ledger, especially not yours." Juno stopped, her hand frozen over the ruined veil. She looked up at him, seeing the raw admission beneath the confession. He was not just fighting for his port, he was fighting a ghost. "Then we end this," Juno said, her voice gaining a new, hard strength. "We end it with the truth, without burning down the city to do it." The night before the wedding, the power grid of Port Crescent died. It was not a flicker or a brownout. It was a sudden, surgical severance. One moment. Echelon Tower was a beacon of light. The next, it was a tomb, the emergency-only lights casting a sickly green glow down the endless corridors. The silence was heavy, absolute. "Is this Cade?" Juno's voice was sharp in the darkness of the penthouse. "No!" Rowan's voice came from the massive window, where he had been watching the city. "This is old infrastructure failing. This is just the city collapsing under its own weight. Come with me." He did not lead her to the emergency stairs. He guided her by the elbow to a private service elevator she had never seen, its panel lit by a separate, humming generator. The doors opened not into a hallway, but directly onto the rooftop. The wind met them like a physical blow, raw and cold, carrying a fine mizzle that was less rain and more a saturated atmosphere. The city below was gone. It was a black ocean, a void where millions of lights had been, punctuated only by the distant, desperate headlights of cars moving through a dead world. The mist beaded instantly on Juno's skin, plastering a few loose strands of her hair to her temple and the high arch of her cheekbone. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Rowan stood beside her, a dark shape against the darker sky. He turned his head, his profile barely illuminated by the faint, pulsing red light of a distant cell tower. He lifted his hand, his movement slow, giving her time to pull away. She did not. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed the damp hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, almost hesitant. His fingertips lingered for a moment on the curve of her cheekbone, a silent question. His eyes, pools of darkness, were not demanding, they were asking. In the sterile silence of the church rehearsal, their contact had been staged in the humid air of the conservatory. It had been a signal. Here, in the absolute, anonymous dark, with no AIO handlers listening and no snipers watching, there was no script. Juno made the decision. She closed the small distance between them, a single step. She did not lift her face to his. Instead, she turned, fitting herself into the space beneath his chin, and rested her forehead against the solid, warm expanse of his shoulder. She felt the sharp, sudden intake of his breath, the tensing of the muscles across his chest. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed, his body accepting hers. One of his arms came around her, his hand spreading wide and firm across the small of her back, holding her to him. It was a gesture of anchoring, not of possession. They stood in the wind, their breathing sinking, her ear pressed close enough to hear the steady, reliable beat of his heart. The act was gone. This was the only truth. "I used to hate the rain," he said, his voice a low vibration against her temple, softer than she had ever heard it. She remained still, listening. "When I was 17, he continued, his gaze fixed on the Black Sea below. "I was living on the docks, not in a house. On the planks of Rook Pier, I had a stolen tarp and one change of clothes." The arm around her tightened, a reflexive memory. "I remember this one night, a storm came in. Cold, horizontal rain. I watched two kids, younger than me, huddled under a rusted loading crane. They were shivering so hard I could hear their teeth chattering from 50 feet away. They weren't just cold, they were starving." His breath hitched, just once. "I swore that night on that wet wood that if I ever got power, no one in my city would ever shiver in the rain from hunger again." The confession hung in the air, explaining everything. The scholarships, the housing projects, the ruthless, protective order he forced upon his world. He was not just a boss, he was a shield. Juno pulled back, just enough to look up at him. She raised her hand and pressed her palm flat against his chest, covering his heart. She felt the steady, powerful, patient rhythm. It was like a harbor pump, she thought, moving the lifeblood of the port. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her voice thick. "Now keep me." That was the permission. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion. It was a slow discovery. It began as a question, a soft, tentative pressure, testing the truth of the moment. Juno answered, her lips parting, and the exploration deepened. It was a conversation without words, a mapping of lines and textures in the dark. His hand slid from her back, moving up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just beneath her ear. Her own hand, the one on his chest, clenched, grabbing a fistful of his shirt, pulling him closer. The cold, the wind, the city had all dissolved. He guided her backward until her back met the cold glass of the rooftop's small glass-enclosed shelter. The barrier seemed to ignite the kiss, turning the slow burn into a definite heat. His mouth left hers, tracing a line of warmth down her jaw, pausing at the frantic pulse in the hollow of her throat. Juno tilted her head back, a silent offering, her fingers threading into the thick hair at the nape of his neck. Their clothing remained a frustrating, intact barrier. The only points of contact were their mouths, her throat, their hands, and the hard line of their bodies pressed together. The silence was broken by the sound of their breathing, ragged and uneven, and a few soft, shaky whispers that were almost laughs of disbelief. Juno felt his hand move, settling on the curve of her waist. She took his wrist, guiding his hand, placing his palm flat on the thin fabric covering the small of her back. It was a silent direction, a yielding of her armor. He understood the signal. He leaned his forehead against hers, their lips almost touching. "Juno," he breathed. his voice rough with a restraint she could feel thrumming through his entire body. If you say stop, everything stops. Right now. The offer of control, his complete surrender to her boundaries, was more intimate than any touch. She looked at him, at the desire warring with the iron discipline in his eyes. This was the man who controlled the docks, and he was giving her the veto. The moment stretched, blossoming into a sharp, aching need that was almost painful. They were balanced on the knife edge of losing control. Juno made the choice. She rose onto her toes, pressing a final, brief, hard kiss to his mouth. Then she exhaled, stepping back into the circle of his arms, not pushing him away, but changing the embrace. She rested her head back over his heart, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist, her knee bumping his. He responded instantly, his own arms locking around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. They chose to stop. They chose to let the desire, the desperate desire, become a promise instead of a drain. They stood like that for a minute, or maybe 10, held together against the void. Then, as if a master switch had been thrown, Port Crescent was born again. The city exploded into light beneath them. The highways became rivers of orange. The towers lit up, block by block. The black ocean became a galaxy of human intention. They pulled apart slightly, both looking down at the resurrected world. The game was back on. Rowan looked at her, his face now clear and sharp in the electric glow. He was no longer the vulnerable boy on the docks. He was the king. But as he looked at her, she saw that the man from the darkness remained. He did not have to say it. She did not have to ask. Tomorrow. When they stood at the altar, it would not be an act. The morning of the wedding, St. Verity was a fortress under siege by 3 invisible armies. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. The Metropolitan Integrity Commission, under the guise of public safety, had installed conspicuous scanner checkpoints at the main gates. Their men wore dark suits and talked into their wrists, a performance of authority meant to intimidate. Tucked behind the overgrown cemetery wall, a nondescript broadcast vehicle labeled WPC News sat humming. This was AIO's unit Hummingbird, its roof bristling with discreet antennae, ready to hijack the local feed and broadcast the ceremony to the world. And then there was the Glass Harbor Collective. A white van marked Port Crescent Florists arrived, and a team of 4 men in matching uniforms began unloading elaborate, funereal sprays of lilies. They were Cade's flower team. Juno was in the sacristy, a cold, oak-paneled room smelling of old incense and lemon oil. Her dress, the real one, felt less like a costume and more like armor. She was alone. A moment of staged silence before the performance. She ran her hand along the underside of the carved wooden chair where she was supposed to sit. Her fingers brushed against something small, smooth, and cold. She knelt, tilting her head. Taped just beneath the seat cushion was a black lacquered rice grain microphone, its wire disappearing into the upholstery. It wasn't AIO tech. It was too slick. It was probably MIC. She checked the ornate kneeling cushion at the altar. A second, identical bug was sewn into the velvet. They both wanted it. The AIO wanted proof of the vows to use as leverage against Rowan's rivals. The MIC wanted the same recording to prove the marriage was a fraudulent financial transaction. They were all trying to trap the words. While Juno faced her own infiltration, Rowan was launching his... He was not in a tuxedo. In the Echelon penthouse, he stood over a tactical map of the docks. He gave 2 final orders. The first was to the Rook Pier crew: every back alley, sewer grate, and access tunnel within 6 blocks of St. Verity was to be silently sealed. No one was getting out, or in, without his permission. His second order was a financial kill shot. He was rerouting his 3 largest container ships, diverting 90% of the port's legitimate cargo to a secondary channel, intentionally triggering a cascade failure in Cade Volkov's illicit logistics. He was draining Cade's bank accounts while Cade was busy trying to start a war. The priest, Father Michael, found Juno in the sacristy. He was pale, his hands shaking as he held a plain cardboard box. "Miss Hart, this arrived 30 minutes ago." Inside was a rolled-up set of blueprints. "These are not the church's plans," the priest whispered. "They're wrong. The load-bearing columns are all mislabeled." At the bottom of the schematic, a note was scrawled, "Cancel the wedding, or St. Verity's structural weaknesses will be exposed. It will collapse." It was a crude, brilliant extortion attempt designed to cause panic. "It's a fake, Father," Juno said, her voice calm, projecting a certainty she didn't feel. "It's meant to scare you. You and I are going to walk out that door and proceed exactly as planned." He nodded, reassured by her steel. As he left, Juno pulled out her secure AIO phone. She typed one message to her handler. "They're bugging the altar. So is the MIC. Pull all your audio surveillance from the building. Now, I will not have this ceremony compromised by competing signals. I'll get you what you need. Activate the data anchor if I deem it necessary." She hit send. She had just taken command of the operation. Juno walked to the side door of the church. The guests were filing in a mix of stony-faced dock bosses, confused city philanthropists, and dozens of dock worker families, all present as Rowan's community witnesses. She saw him then, Cade Volkoff. He was disguised as a press photographer, a cheap laminate badge on his jacket. He carried a heavy camera bag and, in his other hand, a large, beautiful bouquet of white roses. Juno recognized the tech hidden in the foliage, a military-grade signal jammer. He wanted to cut them off, to turn the church into a dead zone. No phones, no police radios, no AIO feed, a silent box for a clean execution. Rowan's men, the harbor wardens, moved. They were dressed as ushers and security, and they began to converge on Cade from 3 directions. Rowan, now in his tuxedo, stood in the narthex, his eyes locked on Volkoff, his hand slipping inside his jacket. "Rowan, no," Juno said, stepping in front of him, her hand on his chest. His eyes were lethal. "He's in my church." "And you will not turn this house into a war zone," she commanded, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "You will not spill blood in front of those families. You trust me. You stand down. We do this my way, with the truth." It was the ultimate test. His instinct, his entire life, screamed to eliminate the threat. He looked at her hand on his chest, at the absolute conviction in her eyes. He took a slow breath, the fury receding, replaced by a cold, calculated trust. He gave a single, almost invisible hand signal. The harbor wardens stopped, melting back into the shadows, holding their perimeter. He had just handed her the reins. The organ music swelled. It was time. The massive bronze bell in the main tower began to toll, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. Bong, bong, bong. The guests rose to their feet. Juno, standing in the doorway, ready to walk the aisle, froze. Rowan's training. Listen for the interruption in the pattern. It was there. Mixed in with the deep resonance of the bronze was a faint, secondary tone, a high-frequency, electronic hum that peaked with each strike of the clapper. It was not an echo. It was a receiver, a device. Somewhere in the church was primed to detonate on a specific sound frequency. The bell was the trigger. She paled. Cade's fake blueprints. The threat of collapse, it was not extortion. It was the plan. She pressed her lips together, her mind racing. The bell tolled again. She had seconds. She reached into the small, elegant clutch bag she carried, the smart wallet. Her fingers found the smooth, metal rim. She tapped it twice. The data anchor whirred to life, its processor instantly scanning all local frequencies. It found the vibration lock signal and, in a nanosecond, broadcast a powerful inverse waveform, a counter signal that scrambled and locked the receiver's frequency, delaying the detonation. She had just bought them. Maybe a few minutes. The organ music paused, hanging in the air, a prelude to her entrance. The delay was only a few seconds, but in the sacristy, it felt like an hour. Juno stood by the door, her hand still tingling from the data anchor. The door from the side chapel clicked open. It was not Rowan. It was Cade Volkoff. He was still in his photographer's disguise, the bouquet of roses held casually in one hand. The jammer was active. She could feel the faint, high-frequency pressure in her ears. The air was dead. He gave her a half-smile, appreciative, predatory. "End of the line, blueprint," he said, his voice soft. "It's a good performance, but the play is over. You belong on the winning side." Juno did not look at the bouquet. She looked at him. She forced her body to relax, to signal consideration. "You're offering me an exit." "I'm offering you a promotion. Rowan's world is built on old rules. I'm building a new one." Juno tilted her head, as if intrigued. "It's a bold move. Disguises, signal jammers. That bouquet is sophisticated, a one-man show." Cade chuckled. "You think I build my own toys? No. You have to know the right people. My man, Gregor, he's an artist. The jammer in this," he tapped the roses, "is a masterpiece. It creates a complete blackout, a 500-meter radius. No phones, no AIO, no police, just us." "And the structural threat, the blueprints," she pressed, playing the admiring colleague. "A simple frequency trigger. The bell tower resonates at a specific hertz. Gregor's device in the main flower display is set to piggyback on that exact vibration. Simple physics. The whole thing comes down." Juno's mind raced. "Gregor, frequency trigger, main flower display." She tapped her wallet again. 2 quick, decisive strokes. The data anchor activated its audio recording, capturing Cade's voice, memorizing the specific ambient frequencies in the room, logging the confession. But the jammer was powerful. The AIO, in their van, would hear nothing. Unit Hummingbird was blind and deaf. This data was for her, and her alone, for now. "Impressive," Archie said, her voice genuine. "You've thought of everything." "I always do," Cade said. "She's not going anywhere." Rowan's voice cut through the dead air. He stood in the main doorway, a dark silhouette against the light of the church. He had seen Cade enter. The harbor wardens were just outside the door, visible as shadows, but they held their position. This was a confrontation for the principals. Cade's smile widened. The groom, right on cue. The 3 of them stood in a silent triangle. The only light came from the tall, stained glass window depicting a forgotten saint, casting bars of deep blue, blood red and sick yellow light across their faces. It was not a blessing. It was war paint. Cade lifted the bouquet, a mock toast. "It's a shame, Rowan, all this effort, the public spectacle, the borrowed bride, and for what, the Sable Crown Trust has one condition, a public bond, no bride." He gestured to Juno. "No money." He looked at the jammer. "And no public, no empire." It was a precise, brutal attack aimed directly at Rowan's pride and his legacy. Juno saw the shift in Rowan's shoulders. She saw the muscles in his jaw bunch, the primal urge to lunge, to eliminate the threat with the violence his world understood. Before he could move, Juno spoke, her voice sharp and clear, slicing into Cade's monologue. "He's not afraid of losing the money, Cade," she said. Cade turned, surprised by her defense. Juno stepped forward, positioning herself between them. "You're afraid of him getting it," she countered. "You're not afraid of the boss. You're afraid of the builder. You're terrified that money is going to flow through the hands of someone who actually knows how to use it for the workers, not just for his own pocket. You can't compete with that. You can't compete with loyalty." Cade's smirk remained, but his eyes, for 1/10 of a second, went cold with a flicker of pure, animalistic anger. She had hit the nerve. He was not just a rival, he was jealous. Rowan took a half step, his hand moving. This was it. Juno moved faster. She put her hand on Rowan's wrist, her fingers wrapping around the bone, and squeezed. It was not a plea. It was a command. "Wait for me." Rowan froze, his gaze shifting from Cade to her. He saw the plan in her eyes, the icy, calculated intellect that matched his own. He held his ground. Juno turned back to Cade, her expression now one of pure business. "You're right about one thing. This is a transaction, so let's make a deal." Cade laughed. "A deal, I have the jammer. I have the trigger. You have nothing." "You have an audience," Juno corrected him. "You went to all this trouble to send a message. But with that jammer, the only people who hear the church collapse are the people inside it. Your shadow shareholders, the investors you're trying to impress. They'll never know you won." She saw the flicker of doubt. She was right. "Here's the deal," she continued, her voice low and persuasive. "You let this wedding happen. You let the AIO broadcast go live, and in return, you get what you really want, the microphone." "What?" "When the priest asks if anyone objects, you stand up. You read your congratulations, a full 30 seconds, live on every network. You can send any message you want. You can tell your partners the war is over. You can destroy Rowan's reputation right at the altar. You get to detonate your bomb in public." Cade, a verbal one. Cade stared at her, the pieces visibly clicking into place. It was a better victory. To not just kill Rowan, but to publicly humiliate him, hijack his ceremony, and announce his own ascendance to his secret backers. It was an irresistible act of ego. He did not know that her data anchor was still active. He did not know she had already bought them a few precious, unjammable minutes by locking the frequency. 30 seconds, Cade said, tasting the idea. "I get the microphone." "You get the microphone," Juno confirmed. He nodded slowly. "A much better ending. I'll be in the front pew." He turned and walked out of the sacristy, leaving the scent of roses and ozone behind. The organ music swelled again, this time for real, the final call. Rowan turned to her, his face a storm of fury, confusion, and a new, stunning respect. "You just negotiated with a man who is trying to bury us." "I just gave him a stage to hang himself on," she corrected. She smoothed the front of her dress, her own hands perfectly steady. She looked up at him, the man she was about to betray and save in the same breath. "When you pull me close at the altar," she whispered, her voice fierce, "don't just act it, believe me." The organ exploded into life, not with a gentle hymn, but with a baroque, militant fanfare. The heavy doors opened. The Isle of St. Verity was a sea of white rose petals, but to Juno, it was a firing range. The whispers started instantly. The dock workers and their families, Rowan's community witnesses, stared with open admiration. The city elites, seated near the front, watched with barely concealed suspicion. This was not just a wedding, it was a contested coronation. The AIO cameras, hidden in the floral arrangements, were live. Unit Hummingbird was pushing the feed to every station in the state. She was walking toward the most dangerous man in the city, and every one of his enemies was watching. Rowan stood at the altar, his back to the priest. He was not the calm, masked negotiator. He was a man waiting for a verdict. His eyes, stripped of all artifice, were locked on her. They were dark, intense, and, for the first time, completely open. He was not faking this. When she reached the dais, she didn't just give him her hand, he took it, and in one smooth, undeniable motion, he pulled her close. Not close for the cameras. He pulled her flush against his side, his arm locking around her waist, a grip that said mine to the entire world. It was not a performance. It was a declaration of a life-and-death alliance. Father Michael, still visibly shaken, raised his hands. "We are gathered here today." He rushed through the preamble, his voice tight. He reached the critical moment. "If any person here can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now, or else hereafter forever hold their peace." Silence. Then, the sound of a shoe scraping on stone. Cade Volkov rose from the front pew. He held the large bouquet of white roses, the one containing the jammer. He smiled at the stunned crowd, the very picture of a forgiving rival. "Father," he said, his voice smooth, "I bring a gift, a gesture of peace for the happy couple." He advanced on the altar. Rowan tensed, his body coiling. Juno's hand shot out, stopping him. "We accept," Juno said, her voice ringing clear and strong. She stepped forward, meeting Cade halfway, taking the heavy bouquet from his hands. As she took it, her left hand, the one holding her smart wallet, brushed against the base of the bouquet. Her fingers tapped the rim. 2 taps. The data anchor initiated the handshake protocol. It recognized the jammer's active data stream, but instead of fighting it, the anchor began to copy it, diverting the jammer's high-frequency output and converting it into a passive diagnostic log. The dead zone Cade had created suddenly had a leak. Believing his jammer was working, Cade turned to the altar. He smoothly bypassed the priest, grabbing the ceremonial microphone. "My blessing for the groom," he announced. He looked directly at Rowan. "You thought an old man's will could save you, but the trust is a curse, and this wedding—" In the AIO van Unit Hummingbird, the technician stared at his console. "Sir," he said, "the audio. It's coming back online. I'm getting a clean feed, routed through. I don't know what, but it's clear." Cade continued his speech, unaware his voice was now being broadcast live. "This wedding is a fraud. The bride is a corporate mercenary. The groom is a failing relic. My partners at Glass Harbor." He was speaking in code now. To his invisible investors. "Know that today the Khazarian Empire officially defaults. The port is ours." At the MIC checkpoint, the agents monitoring the feed froze. They had been waiting for proof of Rowan's fraud. Instead, they were listening to Cade Volkov confess to extortion, conspiracy, and public endangerment, all while holding a known signal jammer inside a house of worship. The evidence they were collecting was not for Rowan. It was for Cade. Cade's victory was palpable. He smiled, triumphant. But in the second pew, one of his flower team, the technician realized the broadcast light on a press camera was on. He knew the jammer had failed. He shouted a harsh, guttural sound and reached inside his jacket. He was fast, but Rowan was faster. Rowan didn't hesitate. He didn't draw a weapon. He moved, spinning Juno behind him, shielding her entire body with his own, accepting the bullet he knew was coming. The shot never came. The harbor wardens, who'd been waiting for this exact breach of protocol, moved as one. 3 of the ushers converged on the gunman. A hand clamped the weapon before it cleared the jacket. A second hand covered the man's mouth. A third drove hard into his solar plexus. He was neutralized, suffocated, and dragged out a side door in less than 3 seconds. No shots, no noise, just silent. Brutal efficiency. The chaos was a ripple. Seen only by the first 5 pews, the dock workers in the back only saw the tension. Cade was paralyzed, his face a mask of disbelief. He had lost. Juno stepped out from behind Rowan, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the live camera. She looked at Cade. Then she looked at Rowan. "Read your vows," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Read your vows." Rowan understood. He did not look at the priest. He did not look at Cade. He looked directly into the lens of the main AIO camera, speaking to the entire city. "I will not promise heaven." His voice was rough, choked with the adrenaline of the last 30 seconds. "I promise stability. I promise that as long as I am head of this port, no worker will be replaced by a machine he cannot be trained to operate. I promise to protect the families who built this city." He looked at Juno. "And I promise to legalize every gray channel, to bring the 5th channel into the light, and to run a transparent line. This is my bond, to the port and to her." It was not a vow, it was a manifesto. The MIC agents were speechless. The AIO was silent. The silence in the church was broken by one longshoreman in the back row, who stood up and began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire church, the dock workers, the families, the witnesses was on its feet, the applause deafening, a roar of thunder that shook the stained glass. Cade Volkov stood alone in the aisle, defeated not by a bullet but by a promise. The second bell began to toll, the sound now clear and free of the electronic hum. Rowan turned to Juno, his hands finding her waist, his body shaking from the adrenaline. He pressed his forehead against hers, the exact move they had rehearsed. But this was raw, his breath hot, his eyes squeezed shut. "No more playing, Juno," he choked out. "Not ever." Cade, trapped in the aisle by the thunderous applause, his face a mask of pure, reptilian hatred, reached inside his jacket. This was not a surrender. It was his final, spiteful act. He pulled a small, black detonator. He had lost the public war, so he would take the physical one. He pressed the button. He was waiting for the third toll of the great bell. It came, bong. The sound vibrated through the floor, and with it, Juno heard Rowan's lesson from the docks. Listen for the interruption in the pattern. It was not the main bell. It was a new sound, a high-frequency, mechanical vibration coming from inside the massive, ancient oaken flower dais that stood near the altar. It was a secondary device. Gregor, Cade's technician, had built a failsafe. This one was armed by the first two bells and set to detonate on the third vibration. Juno did not hesitate. She did not scream. She acted. She lunged sideways, breaking from Rowan's side, her white wedding dress sweeping across the stone tiles like a wave. The crowd gasped, thinking she was faint, overcome with emotion. Rowan, seeing the fierce, analytical focus in her eyes, did not stop her. She reached the dais in 2 strides. Her smart wallet was already in her hand. She slammed her palm flat against the carved wood, her 2 fingers connecting with the metal rim of the data anchor. The vibration under her hand was escalating, a whine building to a peak. She had, perhaps, 1 second. The anchor scanned, locked onto the device's trigger frequency. Her mind flashed to the layout of the church, the side chapel, the small auxiliary bell tower, the one used for daily mass, not for ceremonies. She did not try to block the signal. She redirected it. Using the anchor's own transmitter, she sent a powerful, focused pulse of energy, spoofing the exact vibrational signature the detonator was looking for, but routing it, like a data packet, toward the auxiliary chapel's bell, 50 yards away. The timer, confused by the sudden, overwhelming signal from the wrong bell, triggered prematurely. A muffled, heavy whump echoed from outside the main sanctuary. The stained glass windows rattled in their leaden frames, but they held. The crowd screamed, ducking in their pews. The charge, a small but potent block planted in a heavy stone flower pot in the outer courtyard, Cade's structural weakness detonated harmlessly. It blew damp earth, stone fragments, and lily petals 20 feet into the gray air. It was the final, pathetic firework of the Glass Harbor Collective. No one was hurt, but it was the last, undeniable piece of evidence. The main doors of St. Verity burst open. It was not the MIC, it was the AIO, the gray man, his face like stone, led a team of 6 federal agents in black tactical gear. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency, ignoring the crowd, their mission clear. At the main entrance, the MIC agents stood frozen by their now useless scanners. Their entire case, their attempt to trap Rowan, had been publicly broadcast. They had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and were now witnesses to an act of domestic terrorism by the very man they had ignored. The AIO team walked past the altar. They did not look at Rowan. They walked straight to Cade Volkov, who stood paralyzed in the aisle, the useless detonator still clutched in his hand. They clamped his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs echoing in the sudden, profound silence. Cade Volkov was arrested on the steps of the altar. In the ringing silence, Father Michael looked at the AIO agents, at the smoking hole in his courtyard, and then at Juno. His voice was shaking, but his eyes were sharp. "My child," he asked, his voice carrying clearly to the stunned crowd, "are you still just playing?" Juno turned. She looked past the agents, past the whispering guests, and found Rowan's eyes. He was waiting, his entire world, his entire port balanced on her answer. She smiled. It was not a performance. It was a slow, dawning, absolute truth. "No, Father," she said, "I'm not—" Rowan's breath left him in a single, shuddering sigh of relief. "Then let us finish this. the priest declared, his voice finding its old authority. They turned back to the altar. Rowan took her hands. His were steady. He had no scripted vows. He spoke from the truth of the docks. At the waterline or in the storm, he said, his voice rough, for her and the live cameras to hear. I choose you. Juno's voice was just as clear, just as strong, a promise of steel. And I keep you from the storm. They exchanged the rings. They were simple. Heavy bands of platinum, not for show. They were for weight. The AIO cameras, still broadcasting, recorded it all, not the dark, whispered legend of a mafia boss, but the public, binding contract of a new order for Port Crescent. The ceremony ended, the rain had stopped, the clouds breaking. On the wet stone steps of St. Verity, surrounded by the flashing blue lights of AIO vehicles, they paused. Rowan turned to her, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not the desperate, exploratory kiss from the rooftop. This was a confirmation. It was long enough for their heartbeats to finally settle into the same rhythm, and short enough to be a promise, not a spectacle for the crowd. They broke apart, their hands finding each other, fingers lacing together, intertwined like a pair of anchors. The next day, the Sable Crown Trust released its funds. Rowan's first act was not to buy weapons. He held a press conference, Juno at his side, and announced the formation of the Transparent Harbor Fund. It was an independent, publicly audited entity, co-managed by Juno Hart, designed to immediately fund the worker housing, the trade schools, and the infrastructure projects he had shown her. In a windowless room, Juno met the gray AIO man one last time. She slid her smart wallet across the steel table. You will find everything you need, she said. He plugged it in. It was all there. Cade's full confession, the diagnostic logs from the jammer, the audio files of the MIC's attempted bribery, the frequency signature of the bombs. But there was nothing. Not one byte of data from Rowan's private servers. She had kept her word. She had ended the war with the truth. The city was quiet that night. Weeks later, the air was cold and clear, the sky bright with stars. On Rook Pier, the very spot where he had slept on cold wood, Rowan stood, his arms wrapped around Juno from behind. They looked out at Port Crescent. Echelon Tower was a beacon, and the docks moved with a quiet, steady, and legal efficiency. Juno leaned her head back against his chest. What if another storm comes? She whispered. Rowan's arms tightened, pulling her closer, anchoring her to his heart. Then we pull closer at the altar again. A distant ship's horn, low and clear, echoed across the black water. The world faded, leaving only the sound of the harbor and the single, steady heartbeat they now shared. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, Mafia Boss Stories, and like this video. If you enjoyed it, please support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.